Order. The Prime Minister has given the authority for his statement to last longer than 10 minutes. And Order. Before I call the Prime Minister to address the Chamber, I'd like to point out that a British Sign Language interpretation of the statement is available to watch on the Parliament Live TV. I now call the Prime Minister to make his statement. Prime Minister!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I will make a statement on the roadmap that will guide us cautiously but irreversibly towards reclaiming our freedoms while doing all we can to protect our people against COVID. Today's measures will apply in England, but we're working closely with the devolved administrations who are setting out similar plans. The threat remains substantial, with the numbers in hospital only now beginning to fall below the peak of the first wave in April. But we're able to take these steps because of the resolve of the British public and the extraordinary success of our NHS in vaccinating more than 17.5 million people across the UK. The data so far suggests both vaccines are effective against the dominant strains of COVID. Public Health England has found that one dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine reduces hospitalisations and deaths by at least 75%, and early data suggests that the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine provides a good level of protection, though since we only started deploying this vaccine last month, at this stage the size of its effect is less certain. But no vaccine can ever be 100% effective. Not everyone will take them up, and like all viruses, COVID-19 will mutate. So as the modelling released by SAGE today shows, we cannot escape the fact that lifting lockdown will result in more cases, more hospitalisations, and sadly, more deaths. And this would happen whenever lockdown is lifted, whether now or in 6 or 9 months, because there will always be some vulnerable people who are not protected by the vaccines. There is therefore no credible route to a zero COVID Britain, or indeed a zero COVID world. And we cannot persist indefinitely with restrictions that debilitate our economy, our physical and mental well-being, and the life chances of our children. And that is why it is so crucial that this roadmap should be cautious, but also irreversible. We're setting out on what I hope and believe is a one-way road to freedom, and this journey is made possible by the pace of the vaccination programme. In England, everyone in the top 4 priority groups was successfully offered a vaccine by the middle of February. We now aim to offer a first dose to all those in groups 5 to 9 by the 15th of April, and I'm setting another stretching target to offer a first dose to every adult by the end of July. As more of us are inoculated, so the protection afforded by the vaccines will gradually replace the restrictions. And today's roadmap sets out the principles of that transition. The level of infection is broadly similar across England, so we will ease restrictions in all areas at the same time. The sequence will be driven by the evidence, so outdoor activity will be prioritised as the best way to restore freedoms while minimising the risk. At every stage, our decisions will be led by data, not dates, and subjected to 4 tests. First, that the vaccine deployment programme continues successfully. Second, that evidence shows vaccines are sufficiently effective in reducing hospitalisations and deaths. Third, that infection rates do not risk a surge in hospitalisations which would put unsustainable pressure on the NHS. And fourth, that our assessment of the risks is not fundamentally changed by new variants of COVID that cause concern. Before taking each step, we will review the data against these tests. And because it takes at least 4 weeks for the data to reflect the impact of relaxations in restrictions, and we want to give the country a week's notice before each change, there will be at least 5 weeks between each step. The Chief Medical Officer is clear that moving any faster would mean acting before we know the impact of each step, which would increase the risk of us having to reverse course and reimpose restrictions. I won't take that risk. Step 1 will happen from the 8th of March, by which time those in the top 4 priority groups will be benefiting from the increased protection they receive from their first dose of the vaccine. Mr. Speaker, all the evidence shows that classrooms are the best places for our young people to be, and that's why I've always said that schools would be the last to close and the first to reopen. Based on our assessment of the current data against the 4 tests, I can tell the House that 2 weeks from today, pupils and students in all schools and further education settings can safely return to face-to-face teaching, supported by twice-weekly testing of secondary school and college pupils. Families and childcare bubbles will also be encouraged to get tested regularly. Breakfast and after-school clubs can also reopen, and other children's activities, including sport, can restart where necessary to help parents to work. Students on university courses requiring practical teaching, specialist facilities, or on-site assessments will also return. But all others will need to continue learning online, and we will review the options for when they can return by the end of the Easter holidays. From the 8th of March, people will also be able to meet one person from outside their household for outdoor recreation, such as a coffee on a bench or a picnic in a park, in addition to exercise. But we're advising the clinically extremely vulnerable to shield at least until the end of March. Every care home resident will be able to nominate a named visitor able to see them regularly, provided they're tested and wear PPE. And finally, we will amend regulations to enable a broader range of COVID-secure campaign activities for local elections on the 6th of May. As part of Step 1, we will go further and make limited changes on 29th of March when schools go on Easter holidays. It will become possible to meet in limited numbers outdoors where the risk is lower. So the rule of 6 will return outdoors, including in private gardens, and outdoor meetings of 2 households will also be permitted on the same basis so that families in different circumstances can meet. Outdoor sports facilities such as tennis and basketball courts and open-air swimming pools will be able to reopen, and formally organised outdoor sports will resume, subject to guidance. From this point, 29th of March, people will no longer be legally required to stay at home, but many lockdown restrictions will remain. People should continue to work from home where they can and minimise all travel wherever possible. Step 2 will begin at least 5 weeks after the beginning of Step 1 and no earlier than the 12th of April, with an announcement at least 7 days in advance. If analysis of the latest data against the 4 tests requires a delay, then this and subsequent steps will also be delayed to maintain the 5-week gap. In Step 2, non-essential retail will reopen, as will personal care, including hairdressers, I'm glad to say, and nail salons. Indoor leisure facilities such as gyms will reopen, as will holiday lets, but only for use by individuals or household groups. We will begin to reopen our pubs and restaurants outdoors, and honourable members will be relieved there will be no curfew, and the Scotch egg debate will be over because there will be no requirement for alcohol to be accompanied by a substantial meal. Zoos, theme parks and drive-in cinemas will reopen, as will public libraries and community centres. Step 3 will begin no earlier than the 17th of May. Provided the data satisfies the 4 tests, most restrictions on meetings outdoors will be lifted, subject to a limit of 30. And this is the point when you will be able to see your friends and family indoors, subject to the Rule of 6 or the meeting of 2 households. We will also reopen pubs and restaurants indoors, along with cinemas and children's play areas, hotels, hostels and B&Bs, theatres and concert halls will reopen their doors. And the turnstiles of our sports stadia will once again rotate, subject in all cases to capacity limits depending on the size of the venue. And we will pilot larger events using enhanced testing with the ambition of further easing of restrictions in the next step. Step 4 will begin no earlier than the 21st of June. With appropriate mitigations, we will aim to remove all legal limits on social contact, and on weddings and other life events, we will reopen everything up to and including nightclubs and enable large events such as theatre performances above the limits of Step 3, potentially using testing to reduce the risk of infection. Mr. Speaker, our journey back towards normality will be subject to resolving a number of key questions. And to do this, we will conduct 4 reviews. 1 will assess how long we need to maintain social distancing and face masks. This will also inform guidance on working from home, which should continue wherever possible until this review is complete. And it will be critical in determining how Parliament can safely return in a way that I know honourable members would wish. A second review will consider the resumption of international travel, which is vital for many businesses which have been hardest hit, including retail, hospitality, tourism and aviation. A successor to the Global Travel Task Force will report by the 12th of April so that people can plan for the summer. The third review will consider the potential role of COVID status certification in helping venues to open safely, but mindful of the many concerns surrounding exclusion, discrimination and privacy. And the fourth review will look at the safe return of major events. Mr. Speaker, as we proceed through these steps, we will benefit from the combined protection of our vaccines and the continued expansion of rapid testing. We will extend the provision of free test kits for workplaces until the end of June, and families, small businesses and the self-employed can collect those tests from local testing sites. Mr. Speaker, in view of these cautious but I hope irreversible changes, people may be concerned about what these changes mean for the various support packages for livelihoods for people and for the economy. So I want to reassure the House, we will not pull the rug out. For the duration of the pandemic, the government will continue to do whatever it takes to protect jobs and livelihoods across the UK. And my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, will set out further details in the budget next Wednesday. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we must remain alert to the constant mutations of the virus. Next month, we will publish an updated plan for responding to local outbreaks with a range of measures to address variants of concern, including surge PCR testing and enhanced contact tracing. We can't, I'm afraid, rule out reimposing restrictions at local or regional level if evidence suggests they are necessary to contain or suppress a new variant which escapes the vaccines. Mr. Speaker, I know there will be many people who will be worried that we are being too ambitious and that it is arrogant to impose any kind of plan upon a virus. And I agree that we must always be humble in the face of nature and we must be cautious. But I really also believe that the vaccination programme has dramatically changed the odds in our favour, and it is on that basis that we can now proceed. And of course, Mr. Speaker, there will be others who will believe that we could go faster on the basis of that vaccination programme. And I understand their feelings, and I sympathise very much with the exhaustion and the stress that people are experiencing and that businesses are experiencing after so long in lockdown. But to them, and to them all, I say that today the end really is in sight, Mr. Speaker, and a wretched year will give way to a spring and a summer that will be very different and incomparably better than the picture we see around us today. And in that spirit, Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement and for the telephone call between us earlier today. Mr. Speaker, this is the third time the Prime Minister has announced a plan to come out of national lockdown. In the past, we've emerged without sufficient caution, without a clear plan, and without listening to the science. We can't afford to make those mistakes again. This has to be the last lockdown. Now, the vaccine rollout, as the Prime Minister said, has been remarkable, and I want to pay tribute to everybody involved. It is the light at the end of the tunnel, but if we're going to get there, we have to tread very carefully. So I'm glad the Prime Minister spoke today of caution, of this being irreversible, of assessing the data and following the evidence. Those are the right guiding principles. And I have to say it's a welcome change from some of the language the Prime Minister has used in the past. And I urge the Prime Minister now to stick to that. Turning to the substance of the matter, first, schools. We all agree that the priority must be for all children to be back in school as quickly as possible and to stay in school. We want that to happen on March the 8th, as the government has promised. Confidence of parents, teachers and school staff will be critical. So can the Prime Minister please confirm that the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Officer support the full reopening of all schools on March the 8th? And will he commit to publishing all the relevant medical evidence on this issue? Can the Prime Minister also indicate what the government is doing to overcome the huge logistical challenges this presents? The Prime Minister touched on mass testing in his statement, but there was nothing on Nightingale classrooms and extra capacity. This is a huge problem, particularly for schools with smaller buildings. So can the Prime Minister update the House on how he's going to deal with this in just over 2 weeks' time? Let me turn to a linked issue. Within weeks of schools returning last autumn, thousands of teachers and school staff were self-isolating, causing huge disruption to the running of schools and children's learning. We don't want that again. That's why we called for the early vaccination of all teachers and school staff. In my own constituency, the fantastic Crick Institute, which has been doing amazing work, has been vaccinating hundreds of people a day. They've been very clear to me and publicly that they could be doing more. And it's obvious to me that over one weekend, they could have vaccinated all teachers and school staff in Camden if they'd been allowed to do so, and without bumping anyone else from the priority list. There are similar examples across the country. So will the Prime Minister see what more can be done to speed up the vaccination of teachers and school staff to ensure that children and young people not only return to school on March the 8th, but stay in school having returned? Let me turn then to isolation support. As we release health measures, however gradually, there's a risk that infection rates will go up. The Prime Minister made that clear in his statement. Therefore, it's more important than ever that test, trace and isolate is working and working well. One of the most concerning figures in a recent SAGE report is that only 3 in 10 people who should be self-isolating are actually doing so. And it's obvious that one of the main drivers of this is insecurity at work. As the chair of Test and Trace has said, people are scared to take the test because they can't afford to self-isolate. That not only harms our health response, it costs the economy too, and it's got to be fixed. We've proposed that the £500 isolation payment, which is currently only available to 1 in 8 workers, be made available to everyone who needs it. Will the Prime Minister consider that? Because if we don't shift the 3 in 10 Third, Mr. Speaker, economic. But it won't have escaped businesses questioning the health basis, and the Prime Minister should give it to them today. The Prime Minister should also announce proper support for the 3 million self-employed who've been left out of all support for the last year. This morning on LBC, I was asked about this again by a self-employed businesswoman who's at her wit's end at the lack of government support. This roadmap means that she may not be able to get up and running again in her business until mid-June. So surely the Prime Minister needs to act now to close the gaps for these 3 million. Mr. Speaker, we support the twin principles that the Prime Minister has set out today, that lifting of restrictions must be both cautious and irreversible. But I know the Prime Minister will come under pressure from those on his own benches to go faster and to throw caution to the wind. Last week it was reported that around 60 of his own members of Parliament called for the end of all restrictions by the end of April. I'm sure there are going to be similar calls this afternoon. I hope the Prime Minister takes the opportunity to face this down. Because if this roadmap is to work, he needs to listen to the Chief Scientific Officer and the Chief Medical Officer, not the honourable members for Wickham or the Forest of Dean. If the Prime Minister does, he will have our support and will secure a majority in the House. If he does not, we will waste all the sacrifices of the last 12 months. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Well, I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for his overall support for the roadmap, and indeed I welcome his support for the vaccine rollout, and I'm sure that many people will be glad to hear what he says. I can't help but reminding you, Mr. Speaker, that the right honourable gentleman did vote to stay in the European Medicines Agency, which would have made a vaccine rollout at this speed impossible, Mr. Speaker. And he's right to say that it's a priority to get schools back safely, and I'm delighted that he agrees with that. And I can certainly say that plan for March the 8th for all schools back on March the 8th is supported by the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor, and it would be a good thing if he could perhaps persuade some of his friends in the unions to say so as well, Mr. Speaker. And finally, to say that schools are safe. He mentions self-isolation, the importance of self-isolation, and we will continue to support those who are asked to self-isolate and indeed increase our package of support for them. As for support for business, for the self-employed, which he rightly raises, we will continue to put our arms around businesses and livelihoods around the country, as we have done throughout the pandemic, and the Chancellor, who has been extremely creative in this respect, will be setting out the details in the budget next week, as he would expect. Mr. Speaker, overall, I think we can safely say that we've had cautious support from the leader of the opposition today, but bitter experience has taught me that his support is very far from irreversible, Mr. Speaker. Who knows what he will be saying next week, but I'm glad of it today.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I refer the House to my entry in the Members' Register. Can I say to my right honourable friend that I welcome his statement today. I particularly welcome the return to schools on March the 8th. But there's another sector which is important for jobs in my constituency, which is fundamental to our economy and critical for global Britain: the aviation sector. He says there's going to be a task force report by the 12th of April so people can plan for the summer. That won't allow people to plan. At every stage, the government has taken weeks from these reports to actually provide certainty to the industry. The industry needs 3 months' preparation from the point of certainty. So I ask my right honourable friend to look again at this timetable for that task force report, to bring it forward so we can open up our international air travel and make sure that Britain is open for business.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and she is quite rightly, Mr. Speaker, a doughty campaigner for the aviation industry. and all it brings to our country. And what I can tell her is that we will continue to support that industry throughout these difficult times, but I believe that setting a deadline of April the 12th for the report of the Travel Task Force, the newly formed, reconstituted Travel Task Force, will give people time to make their plans for the summer. And if things go well, Mr. Speaker, if we can meet those these not before dates, then I do believe there is every chance of an aviation recovery later on this year.
Let's head to the leader of the SNP with Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The success of the vaccine rollout, led by our incredible NHS staff, is something to behold and something that we are all thankful for. For the first time in many months, people across these islands are genuinely hopeful that an end to the current level of lockdown is finally in sight. But people also know that there is one major threat that could undo much of this hope. The spread of new international variants of this virus now poses the single biggest threat to finally getting out of this pandemic. That is why quarantine measures for international arrivals is so important. We simply can't afford to get this wrong. And that is why the Scottish Government has taken tough but absolutely necessary action. Those arriving in Scotland on an international flight have to quarantine in a hotel for 10 days. In England, though, the policy only applies to people travelling from red list countries. But, Mr. Speaker, the evidence shows that people across the United Kingdom are demanding stronger measures to prevent the threat of any new variant. YouGov polling last week showed that only 18% support the UK government's rules on quarantine, while a massive 72% of people across the United Kingdom prefer the Scottish Government's comprehensive approach. Prime Minister, your plan to end lockdown will be worthless if your insufficient quarantine measures allow a new variant in through the back door. People right across the United Kingdom are continuing to make huge sacrifices. Children are not yet physically at school. Families are isolated. There is a loneliness epidemic. People are really struggling, and this can't be all for nothing. Do not leave the back door open. Do not risk all the hard work, all the sacrifices that have been made. Given all that is at stake, can you explain why the UK government is failing to introduce the strong quarantine measures that the public across the United Kingdom are demanding? Will the Prime Minister think again and introduce the Scottish Government's comprehensive approach for international travellers? Let us all do what we need to in order to drive down the spread of the virus, to get us all to a position where we can reverse lockdown and begin to restore social interaction for all our well-being.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have amongst the toughest quarantine measures anywhere in the world, as the Right Honourable Gentleman well knows, including the mandatory incarceration in hotels appointed by the government if you return from one of the 33 red list countries, as he well knows. And we will continue to impose very, very tough controls on people coming into this country. He should also know that the new variants we are confident that all our vaccines are effective in reducing death and serious disease, and we have no reason to doubt that they are effective in reducing death and serious disease with the new variants as well, Mr. Speaker. And he should also know that over the course of the next few months we will see new vaccines to defeat these vaccine-escaping variants, and that is something that is evolving the whole time. Other than that, Mr. Speaker, I was delighted by the unaccustomed note of optimism with which the Right Honourable Gentleman began. He isn't often notable for his optimism in this House. He's rolling his eyes, Mr. Speaker, but I think I rather liked it when he began with optimism. I think he should stick to it. I think it suits him. More optimism, I think, from the Right Honourable Gentleman would be I think, nice to hear.
Let's head to the Chair of the Select Committee with Jeremy Hunt. Jeremy Hunt.
Mr. Speaker, talking of optimism, the Prime Minister's approach feels very similar to Harold Wilson, who said he was an optimist, but one who always carried a raincoat. And his caution is absolutely right in the face of these new variants, when we are potentially so close to the finishing line. But as we get there, will he recognise the brilliant work of our health and care staff by building back better for them, potentially in next week's budget, by announcing that we will finally make sure that we're training enough doctors and nurses with a long-term workforce plan, and giving the social care sector a 10-year plan, just as we gave the NHS 10 years ago?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. I pay tribute again, as I have many times before, to the incredible work, not just of our NHS staff, but of our social care staff, who've really borne the brunt of the pandemic and have done fantastically well. And we will certainly be bringing forward reforms of social care in addition to the massive investments that we've already made.
Let's head to Ed Davey. Ed Davey.
Mr. Speaker, the roadmap to recovery must put people hit hardest by this pandemic first, not least people with learning disabilities. They have died at rates more than 3.5 times the rest of the population, yet many are still not being prioritised for vaccination. Jo Wiley has spoken powerfully about how hideously unfair it was to be offered the vaccine before her sister Frances, who is now in hospital with COVID after an outbreak in her care home. And I know many other carers across the country feel the same, while our loved ones remain so vulnerable to this virus. So will the Prime Minister tell us when on his roadmap everyone with a learning disability will have been offered their first jab?
Prime Minister.
The right honourable gentleman is entirely right to draw attention to the particular suffering endured by vulnerable groups throughout this pandemic, and that's why those with learning disabilities, those with particular vulnerabilities, do appear high up in the JCVI priority list, which is, I'm sure, exactly what he would expect.
Let's head to Sir Ian Duncan Smith. Sir Ian.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, can I congratulate my Prime Minister for his incredible bold decision last year. It's due to that, in getting the vaccines rollout going on, that we are now looking at the eventual end to this COVID nightmare. So he deserves all the plaudits he gets for that and more. But I agree with his caution in this rollout and going back to being unlocked. But I just say that the hospitality sector, to my right honourable friend, is the biggest, very big employer of the poorest in society. And it is them who has suffered the most in incomes. And nearly half of those businesses are talking about closing. I just wonder whether the Prime Minister would feel it possible to be able to review again the nature of opening up inside those restaurants and pubs and checking that there is no real risk beyond any of the other elements that he's opening up. And if that is the case, to take that bold decision as and when the data dictates it.
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for what he said just now, and I totally understand where he's coming from and the urgency of those in the hospitality sector who want to open up as soon as possible, as indeed we all do. Everybody in this House wants that to happen. But we also understand the risk of another surge and the consequent risk of a fourth lockdown, Mr. Speaker, which I don't think anybody wants to see, least of all the businesses concerned. And what we have in this roadmap are dates. Admittedly, they are not before dates, but they are dates to which businesses can now work. April the 12th for outdoor hospitality, May the 17th for indoor hospitality. That gives at least some certainty, Mr. Speaker. And I think in this very, very difficult time, with these difficult trade-offs, I think people would be prepared to trade some urgency and some haste for more certainty and more reliability. And that is what we aim to give.
Let's head to Liz Savile-Roberts. Liz Savile-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Yfarydd. Workers across the UK still face a hopeless choice: self-isolating and suffering loss of earnings, or going to work with a risk spreading the virus. Now, 8 months ago, I raised this very problem of the UK's unfit sick pay system with the Prime Minister, but there are still people in work who cannot afford to self-isolate. Ahead of the budget, will the Prime Minister commit to raising and expanding statutory sick pay once and for all as a key long-term lesson to be learnt from this pandemic? Or is he content for our poorest communities to be blighted by ill health now and quite possibly again in future.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Right Honourable Lady. We and repeat the points I've made to her many times before, but I'm grateful to her for raising them again. We will continue to look after people throughout the pandemic. We've increased benefits. There's the payment of £500, Mr. Speaker, and other payments that we'll make available. And our undertaking is to make sure that we protect people, whether they're self-isolating or whether they're forced not to be able to work throughout the duration of the pandemic. And you'll be hearing more about that from the Chancellor on March the 3rd.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thankfully, my right honourable friend has clearly stated today that an extreme zero COVID approach is impracticable. Can he confirm that most, if not all, of his key scientific advisors now accept that our strategic goal must be and is a practical, vaccine-based method of controlling COVID like any other serious respiratory virus, such as influenza?
My right honourable friend is completely right in the analogy he draws, and the only reason I'm able to say, Mr. Speaker, to the country is that we must learn to live with COVID as we live with flu, Mr. Speaker, in the long term, is of course because we have this vaccination programme and the capability to evolve our vaccines.
Let's head south to Caroline Lucas. Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As well as welcoming the success of the vaccination programme, I want to emphasise there is a lack of sufficient financial support for self-isolation. There is, in the words of one of the government's own advisers, a huge gaping hole in the Prime Minister's COVID strategy. The payments aren't enough, they're not reaching the right people. So as well as fixing that once and for all, will he also take this opportunity to respond with the seriousness it deserves to the High Court's ruling on Friday that the Secretary of State acted unlawfully by failing to publish COVID contracts? No one has ever suggested that ministers didn't need to act fast to procure PPE and other COVID-related contracts, but transparency matters even in a crisis. So if the government has nothing to hide, will he now publish details of who benefited from the VIP lane, who lifted the velvet ropes for those favoured companies, what price were they paid and why were they chosen? Parliament and the country have a right to know.
Mr. Speaker, of course we'll continue to look after those who are self-isolating and to improve their support where we can, as I said. As for the contracts that she has just mentioned, all of the details are on the record, and of course it was right to work as fast as we possibly could to get the PPE that this country so desperately needed.
Said no to Imran Ahmad Khan. Imran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the medics and volunteers who've worked so hard in providing COVID-19 vaccines across the kingdom. In the Wakefield CCG area alone, more than 87,000 vaccines have been administered. The vaccine rollout is the fundamental rule out, ensuring that we are able to return to now lamented normality and properly follow the pathway outlined by the Prime Minister just now. Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned that vaccine disinformation has specifically targeted ethnic minority groups, leading to some refusing the vaccine when offered. Can my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, outline what steps the government is taking to encourage BAME groups to receive the vaccine when offered?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I congratulate him on the spectacular throne on which he appears to be sitting, Mr. Speaker. But he and I, not so long ago, were together in the Al Hikmah community centre in Batley, and I again thank all those involved, and indeed community groups up and down the land who are doing an outstanding job in promulgating vaccinations. He raises a very, very important point. I thank him for what he's doing to promote vaccinations for everybody.
Let's go over to Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituents are seeking explanations. Most of them have lost income, many have lost their jobs, all are facing varying degrees of stress, from the very severe to the concern about their lives. Many local small businesses have closed for good because they see no future and they're not getting the support that they need. Yet, Mr. Speaker, I think answers are required from the Prime Minister. How £10.5 billion of NHS contracts were awarded without tender, how a further 99% of all NHS contracts were awarded again without tender, and that last week the court found that the Secretary of State for Health had not acted legally in the awarding of these contracts. And so I ask the Prime Minister to do two things. Will he end this scandalous privatisation of our NHS, which is happening before our very eyes? And will he also replace the Health Secretary with somebody who will stand by and obey the law and publish in advance all contracts that are due to be let, so the public can see how their money is being spent?
Well, Mr. Speaker, to the best of my memory, the Labour Party opposition were advocating during the earlier stages of the crisis that we should secure PPE from, I think, a theatrical impresario who specialised in capes and gowns, and a football agent who claimed to be able to get hold of masks, Mr. Speaker. We went as fast as we possibly could to get PPE, and those who are now denouncing us for going too fast were those who were complaining back then that we weren't going fast enough.
Said to David Simmons. David Simmons.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend and the government have rightly been unapologetic throughout this pandemic in determination to safeguard children's educational opportunities and well-being. Can the Prime Minister confirm that once all schools reopen on the 8th of March, the government will be putting in place all the measures necessary to keep them open, working with academy trusts and crucially local authorities to avoid any further disruption to our children's education?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend because that is exactly why we wish to take this cautious but irreversible approach in order to make sure that we don't have to go back into measures that would keep kids out of school again. And he's quite right in what he says.
Let's head over to Jim Shannon. Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister and Government's progressive roadmap, which of course is underpinned by the incredibly successful rollout of the vaccine? And can the Prime Minister confirm that we have no supply issues and are on target to give the second dose to all of those on the NHS front line who are due their second dose within the next few weeks? And can the Prime Minister assure us that this will not adversely affect the continued supply and the availability of first vaccines for informal carers of those who are shielded? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is completely right to raise this and to care deeply about supply. We have no supply issues at the moment, and we're confident that we can meet our targets.
Let's head to Sir Bernard Jenkins. Sir Bernard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I congratulate the Prime Minister on the fact that there are sunlit uplands that now beckon us, but that he's right to say that the threat remains substantial, because while we're unlocking, at this stage, only a third of the adult population has been vaccinated. So what will the government be doing to minimise the threat of another lockdown, such as strengthening the track and trace and isolate operations, particularly at local level, providing COVID-safe spaces so it's easier for people to self-isolate who are infected, and to deploy testing capacity more effectively, such as, for example, testing school children twice a week in schools, as we're already going to be testing teachers?
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right in the ideas that he puts forward. Test, track and trace has been improving the whole time over the period of the pandemic, and he's right to draw attention to the potential of lateral flow testing, not just in schools, where, as he says, we're going to be doing it twice a week for secondary school pupils after the first couple of weeks, but also rolling it out for companies, for local areas, local communities, to take it up as an additional support, an additional way of fighting the disease.
Let's head to Ruth Jones. Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister was in my right honourable friend's constituency of Torvine last week to see the vaccine programme being rolled out by the Aneurin Bevan University Health Board at Cwmbran Stadium. So I joined with him in thanking all the Welsh NHS staff and volunteers who are working so hard to save lives by rolling out the vaccine programme in this way. However, I wonder if the Prime Minister agrees with me and many people across Newport West who believe that every single penny of public money must be accounted for. And if so, what's he going to say to his Health Secretary, who, according to the courts, breached his legal obligation by not publishing details within 30 days of contracts being signed? We've had 2 attempts at getting the Prime Minister to answer, so I'm hoping it's third time lucky.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ruthlessly to repeat what I said before, which is that I believe that it was absolutely right for this country to secure PPE as fast as we possibly could, indeed, as it just as it has been right to roll out a vaccine programme as fast as we possibly can, and it was great to be in Cwmbran and to see what they're doing there, and that is thanks to the dynamic work of the NHS and indeed of everybody in the Department of Health and Social Care, including the Health Secretary.
Let's wander up to Mark Logan. Mark Logan.
Prime Minister, today I hosted a Zoom between Bolton North East's pubs, restaurants and the Minister for Small Businesses. Can the Prime Minister ensure we allow businesses enough time to improve our hospitality's operating data and make the dates in 2021 utterly delectable?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for what he's doing to help local business and to rally them. And I would just say to them that if we can stick to this roadmap, and I believe that we can, then there is not long to go now for those businesses. There are for hospitality in Bolton. There are 2 dates. There's outdoor hospitality on April the 12th, and then indoor with all its potential on May the 17th. I do believe that gives some dates for us all to think about, for business to work towards, and I hope that will be of some reassurance to them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some eminent members of SAGE have indicated that they're concerned about a resurgence with the return of children to schools. So can the Prime Minister say whether the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Officer support reopening schools in their entirety on the 8th of March? Because during the last term, many schools suffered an enormous amount of disruption because staff were off isolated. And isn't the best way to prevent that happening in the future to ensure that all school staff are vaccinated?
Prime Minister.
I have a deal of respect for the honourable gentleman, since he and I have clashed many times over issues in London. But I think he uncommonly showed a failure to follow what I'd already said in my answer to the right honourable gentleman. The CMO and the CSA both approve of reopening in full.
We now go down to Andrew Griffith. Andrew Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More than anything, the nation's businesses need certainty in order to plan. Today's roadmap provides that certainty, and reopening schools is a welcome and critical element within it. Does the Prime Minister agree that, like navigating lock gates on a canal, it's important we now proceed sequentially, as fast as possible, but always in a forward direction?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as anybody who's steered a narrow boat or a canal boat or barge will know, in a canal, the important thing is not to oversteer one way and then be forced to correct and bump the sides of the canal as you go. And that's what we're trying to avoid, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're embarking on a cautious but irreversible approach.
Let's head up to Debbie Abrahams. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will leave till another time to ask the Prime Minister why we didn't have adequate PPE stocks, given exercise Cygnus in 2016 stipulated we need to increase our PPE stockpiles. But I was really concerned about the Health Secretary's tone on the media round yesterday, where he seemed to infer that he'd done nothing wrong and the judge was actually the one that was making a mistake. This is not how a healthy democracy works. So I repeat the questions of my honourable friend, the member for Brighton Pavilion. Will he publish all outstanding contracts, because there are outstanding contracts that have not been published, bring an end to the emergency procurement powers and reintroduce a tendering process?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I really I can see that there's a concerted attempt to make a point here today about this, but I must say that I do think that every effort was made by the government to secure PPE as fast as we possibly could, and I think that's what the people of this country wanted. We ended up, I think, with 32 billion items of PPE, and we now have the capability, which I think will reassure her constituents more than anything else. We have the capability now in this country, thanks to Lord Dighton and the PPE Task Force and others, to make 70% of our PPE needs in this country.
Let's head to Craig Whittaker. Craig Whittaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is brilliant news that we've vaccinated 1 in 3 adults now in the UK. A huge testament to British science, the NHS, my right honourable friend, the member for West Suffolk and his whole team, and everybody involved in the vaccination programme, not least my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister. But does the Prime Minister agree with me that because of his swift rollout of the vaccine programme, we're in a much stronger position now to start easing restrictions and putting us back on the path to some form of normality much sooner than would have been without a vaccination rollout programme?
Prime Minister.
Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is completely right, and I thank him very much for what he has just said. The only reason this roadmap is possible, and we're one of a tiny number of countries around the world that have been able to set out a roadmap with dates and milestones this far ahead, Mr. Speaker. It's only possible because of the vaccination rollout programme.
Let's head to Neil Coyle. Neil Coyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People of this country have endured so much in the last year, including personal tragedies amongst the highest excess death toll, job losses under the worst damage to any major economy. But they've also seen the Prime Minister's closest advisor, Dominic Cummings, break the COVID regulations, the Home Secretary break the Ministerial Code, and now the Health Secretary break the law to hide crony contracts, all without consequences. Going forward, Prime Minister, will you end the system of one rule for your Tory powers and another for the rest of us?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think contained within that question was possibly another suggestion that we could have done things differently with the procurement of PPE. All I will say is that the contracts are there on the record for everybody to see, and I think most people in this country will understand that in very difficult, if not desperate times, last spring we had to work as fast as we possibly could.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement, especially on schools. He's right to be driven by the evidence. Professor Mark Woolhouse told the Science and Technology Committee last week that during the whole year, and I quote, there has been very, very little evidence of any transmission outdoors happening in the UK. So will my right honourable friend continue to look at the evidence and see whether it's possible to bring back outdoor activities like sports during the weeks ahead? I know with the spring weather coming, that would be a great boon to millions of people across the country.
Prime Minister.
Of course he's right to raise the point about outdoor transmission, and that's why on March the 8th, with the return of schools, we're also going to be seeing school sport, which is great, plus outdoor recreation one-on-one in the way that I described earlier on, Mr. Speaker. And then on March the 29th, it's the rule of 6 plus 2 households together, plus more sport outdoors, Mr. Speaker, of all kinds, up to and including, I think, rugby with tackling, but without the scrums, Mr. Speaker, as I understand the guidance.
Rugby league. Right, let's go up north to Alan Dorrans. Alan Dorrans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good afternoon. Analysis by the Royal College of GPs of NHS England's COVID-19 vaccination figures show that people of black ethnicity are half as likely as people of white ethnicity to get vaccinated, and people of Asian ethnicity are under 2/3 as likely as their white counterparts to accept vaccination. What additional specific steps will the Prime Minister take to encourage greater uptake of the vaccines in these communities?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the number of people receiving the vaccine is actually increasing in all communities on roughly the same gradient, but we're concerned, he's quite right to raise the concern that I think everybody has about uptake in some communities. It is now going faster, and what we've done is rolled out a network of community champions. I think we've put about £23 million into supporting community champions for hard-to-reach, vaccine-resistant communities. And just the most important thing is for everybody to get across the message that the vaccine is a wonderful thing. Everybody should get it. Get your vaccine when you get your message from the NHS.
Sir Graham Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome very strongly the reopening of schools? After what we've put them through over the last year, it's time we prioritise the interests of our children and young people. The Prime Minister also sets out a programme based on data, not dates, and that must be right. But will he please publish the precise criteria for each of those stages to be met? And finally, when the renewal of emergency powers is due, will he undertake to bring that vote to the House before the Easter recess and not after?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. There's going to be a massive, I think, data dump is the word I've been quoted today. So colleagues may already have seen some of the data that's available underpinning the roadmap that we've set out, and there will, of course, be another vote in this House about these measures before Easter, and then those measures, in turn, Mr. Speaker, elapse on June the 21st in the way that I've described.
Let's head to Rachel Hopkins. Rachel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Local council public health teams will continue to be pivotal in controlling the virus, but the government's decade of austerity and cuts has damaged their capacity, with the public health grant last year, 2020-21, being 22% lower per head in real terms compared to 2015-16. So will the Prime Minister tell the House when the public health grant allocation for this year will be announced, and whether it will include a significant real terms increase to ensure councils can continue to keep our communities safe?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful to councils, and particularly public health officials, for the incredible work that they've done in the last year. Absolutely amazing work that they have done. We are supporting them with another £4.7 billion, as she knows, to support local councils in everything they do, and we will continue to offer support throughout the pandemic.
We now go to Peter Aldous.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. For his statement and for the precautionary approach that he is pursuing to lifting the lockdown. It is clear that the impact of COVID will be a long time, and I would thus be most grateful if he could confirm that this plan is coordinated and synchronised with the measures that the Chancellor will announce in the budget, and there will be ongoing support for both badly affected businesses, sectors such as hospitality, and for those people who are relying on the £20 uplift to universal credit.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, we will make sure that we continue to look after people throughout the pandemic, as we have done since the beginning, and the Chancellor will be setting out exactly what we're doing next week.
We now go to Andrew Gwynn.
Been under local restrictions since the end of July, and it's been a long few months. So can I welcome the roadmap out of lockdown and also the success of the vaccine? Now, as somebody who's just been just about shaken off long COVID symptoms 11 months after contracting COVID, can I urge him not to forget those still struggling and the many more who will develop long COVID as a consequence of the latest wave of the virus? As the economy switches back on, as lives return to normal, will he also commit to do more for those who still don't have access to long COVID clinics, who still don't have access to support or help, so that nobody is left behind?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm delighted to see the honourable gentleman back on fighting form as somebody who's enjoyed lively on-screen debates with him in the past. It's good to see him back in shape. He's right to draw attention to long-term consequences of the disease, and we will do everything we can to alleviate suffering and to continue to invest in support for those who need it.
Mark Harper.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all thank the Prime Minister for the measures to get our children back to school on March the 8th. That's very welcome and something we've called for, and I think he should be congratulated on that, and also for the speed of the vaccine rollout. Could I just press him a little on the thoughts behind vaccinating groups 1 to 9? So that's everyone over 50 and those 16 to 64 with a health condition that makes them vulnerable to COVID. Those groups account for 99% of deaths and around 80% of hospitalisation. So for what reason, once they've been vaccinated and protected from COVID by the end of April at the latest, is there any need for restrictions to continue?
Prime Minister.
He makes an excellent, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. The difficulty is that, of course, there will be at least a significant minority who either have not taken up the vaccine in those vulnerable groups for the reasons that the House has been discussing, or who, having had the vaccine, are not given sufficient protection. We believe that the protection is very substantial, but there will be a large minority who will not have sufficient protection. And the risk is that if you let the brakes off, Madam Deputy Speaker, then the disease could surge up in such a way as, again, to rip through a large number rip through those groups in a way that, alas, I don't think anybody in this country would want to see. So I'm afraid it's pure mathematics. There is still a substantial body of risk, and we also need to wait and see exactly what the effects of the vaccine are. There are some promising data, but I think what the country would want at this stage is caution and certainty and irreversibility, and that is what we aim to provide.
We now go to Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Throughout this crisis, the government has been slow to offer the financial support that people need. From 3 million people excluded from any support to thousands they can't afford to miss work. Adequate financial support for
thousands.
Hugh Merriman.
Speaker, and can I welcome the Prime Minister's statement. Those of us who represent constituencies where retail, hospitality and tourism is an absolute lifeblood will really welcome the dates and the fact that domestic holidays in England are open as normal for the summer. But could I ask the Prime Minister just to give a little more detail on the Global Travel Task Force, which reports by 12th of April, and that it will set out the requirements regarding testing, vaccination certificates, social distancing and face masks, and I hope an end towards quarantine.
Yes.
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Travel Task Force will be looking at all those things, quarantine, destinations and so on and so forth. I think at the moment, one consideration is that we need to make sure that there are countries that will be willing to accept British tourists in the way that we would like to see. Some of them have stepped forward and said that they will, but they're currently not very numerous.
We now go to Emma Hardy. Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Lateral flow testing is central to the Prime Minister's educational reopening plans. So can he explain why our only real-world published figures from the student asymptomatic testing programme in Scotland before Christmas showed almost 30% of positive tests turned out to be false when subject to a confirmatory PCR? Considering the financial, educational and mental health impact of self-isolation, does it that a lot of students are going to be told to self-isolate?
Recognise that figure. Lateral flow tests are extremely asymptomatic positive tests and in helping schools to restart, and that's why we're pursuing them.
We now go to Suzanne Webb. Suzanne Webb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the statement today and the prudent and cautious measures to reducing lockdown restrictions. We have all had our role to play in combating this virus, and a role which will continue for some time. So would the Prime Minister join me in saying thank you to all my constituents in Stourbridge for their continued patience and resilience, to the fabulous Dudley NHS, to my care homes, Mary Stevens Hospice, to all those unsung heroes, to my teaching fraternity, the army of vaccinators, to all key workers and those essential workers who have kept us fed and watered, all truly heroic efforts by one and all.
Prime Minister.
Well, I congratulate my honourable friend on her brilliant question. I plant my flag firmly on everything that she's just said and echo it sincerely. I add my thanks not just to the people of Stourbridge for their patience and resilience, but to the people of the entire country.
Now going to Munir Wilson. Munir Wilson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Too often, children and young people have been an afterthought during this pandemic. Aside from lost learning, many children are feeling anxious and lonely due to not seeing their friends, missing out on play and other activities. We know 1 in 4 has self-harmed in the past year. Eating disorder rates are soaring, and demand for acute beds is reaching crisis point. So will the Prime Minister please commit to providing a ring-fence resilience fund for schools, as proposed by Young Minds, to ensure that young people are given the mental health support that they so desperately need?
Prime Minister.
She's absolutely right to draw attention to the endurance, the things that we've asked young people to put up with this year and over the last 12 months. There can't have been a generation like it that's experienced so much disruption to their education. And she's right to call attention to the pressures, the stress that has caused. And so we've invested massively in mental health provision particularly for young people's mental health. And one of the things we've done is appoint a young people's mental health ambassador in the form of Alex George. But the top priority for the government is now not just to get kids back in school on March the 8th, but to make sure that we remediate their education with a programme of much more than £1 billion. And the Secretary of State for Education will be setting out more about our plans to help those pupils later this week.
Now go to Sarah Dines. Sarah Dines.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The people of the country are desperate to be set free as soon as possible. As my right honourable friend knows, many of the tourism and hospitality businesses in Derbyshire Dales have been hit heavily by this pandemic. Can he please encourage the country to book self-catered, self-contained accommodation for staycation holidays in places such as Derbyshire Dales this summer, where families are able to minimise mixing with other people, but to have some fun?
Prime Minister.
She is completely right, and as you will have heard just now, the option to book a staycation, all being well, Madam Deputy Speaker, is now there for April the 12th, and I can't imagine there are many destinations lovelier around then than the Derbyshire Dales.
Now go to Neil Hanvey. Neil Hanvey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Following the High Court ruling that the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care acted unlawfully by failing to comply with transparency rules, will the Prime Minister now publish the names of the companies awarded contracts that were introduced to high priority lanes by ministers, honourable members, peers and officials, and set out any material, financial or fiduciary responsibility or relationship between each company and the persons responsible for that introduction to the priority lane?
Prime Minister.
Yes. I'm grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. I repeat the answer I've given several times. All these contracts are published in the normal way.
We now go to Sir Robert Neal. Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Welcome the Prime Minister's statement, and we all recognise the huge work that's been done to make the vaccine rollout a success. But can I press him upon why some of the dates are set as no earlier than? If we believe in the vaccine, we believe in the programme, and we believe in the data, isn't the logic that if the data shows we can move to free up sectors of the economy sooner, we should not artificially hold them back? Surely that's following the data. Shouldn't there be a little more flexibility there?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we need to see Madam Deputy Speaker. We need to see the data. We need to see the effect of each successive relaxation. And as I explained to the House, we need 4 weeks to assess whether or not the relaxation has caused a surge in the virus, because that's the time it takes. So from the unlocking of the opening of schools until the 12th of April, we'll need to assess that. Then we'll need a further week to give people due notice, and the same onward through May the 17th, June the 21st, and so on. And the reason for that cautious but irreversible approach is that I think people would rather have certainty rather than urgency. And we're going as fast as we reasonably and responsibly can, but if it's a trade-off between haste and certainty, I think people would prefer certainty.
Now going to Tracy Brabin. Tracy Brabin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister will appreciate parts of my constituency and others in West Yorkshire and higher tiers since more freedoms. Our people proportionately high price in building back from a more challenging. The Prime Minister confirmed today that this specific inequality, regional tiers, ensuring our recovery from COVID is truly a national recovery.
Prime Minister.
Yes, she should wait to see what the Chancellor says next week, and we will make sure that we go forward as a one nation together.
William Ragg.
Madam Deputy Speaker, could I congratulate all of the staff and volunteers, particularly